Mass killings occurred under some communist regimes during the 20th century. Estimates of the death toll vary widely, depending on the methodology used. Scholarship focuses on the causes of mass killings in single societies, though some claims of common causes for mass killings have been made. Some higher estimates of mass killings include not only mass murders or executions that took place during the elimination of political opponents, civil wars, terror campaigns, and land reforms, but also lives lost due to war, famine, disease, and exhaustion in labor camps. There are scholars who believe that government policies and mistakes in management contributed to these calamities and, based on that conclusion, combine all these deaths under the categories mass killings, democide, politicide, classicide, or loosely defined genocide. According to these scholars, the total death toll of the mass killings defined in this way amounts to many tens of millions. However, the validity of this approach is questioned by other scholars. In his summary of the estimates in the Black Book of Communism, Martin Myliev suggested a death toll of between 85 and 100 million people. As of 2011, academic consensus has not been achieved on causes of large-scale killings by states, including by states governed by communists. In particular, the number of comparative studies suggesting causes is limited. The highest death tolls that have been documented in communist states occurred in the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin, in the People's Republic of China under Mao Zedong, and in Cambodia under the Khmer Rouge. The estimates of the number of non-combatants killed by these three regimes alone range from a low of 21 million to a high of 70 million. There have also been killings on a smaller scale in North Korea, Vietnam, and some Eastern European and African countries. Terminology: communist regimes refers to those countries who declared themselves to be socialist states under the Marxist-Leninist, Stalinist, or Maoist definition at some point in their history. Scholars use several different terms to describe the intentional killing of large numbers of non-combatants. The following have been used to describe killing by communist governments. Genocide. Under the Genocide Convention, the crime of genocide does not apply to the mass killing of political and social groups. Protection of political groups was eliminated from the UN resolution after a second vote because many states, including Stalin's USSR, anticipated that clause to apply unneeded limitations to the right to suppress internal disturbances. Politicide. The term politicide is used to describe the killing of political or economic groups that would otherwise be covered by the Genocide Convention. Manicide. Midlarsky uses the term politicide to describe an arc of mass killings from the western parts of the Soviet Union to China and Cambodia. In his book The Killing Trap: Genocide in the 20th Century, Midlarsky raises similarities between the killings of Stalin and Pol Pot. Democide. R.J. Rummel coined the term democide, which includes genocide, politicide, and mass murder. Helen Fain has termed the mass state killings in the Soviet Union and Cambodia as genocide and democide. Frank Wayman and Asushi Taga have shown the significance of terminology in that, depending on the use of democide or politicide as the criterion for inclusion in a data set, statistical analyses seeking to establish a connection between mass killings can produce very different results, including the significance or otherwise of regime type. Crime against humanity. Jacques Mellon and Michael Mann believe that crime against humanity is more appropriate than genocide or politicide. When speaking of violence by communist regimes, classicide, Michael Mann has proposed the term classicide to mean the intended mass killing of entire social classes. Terror. Stephen Wheatcroft notes that, in the case of the Soviet Union, terms such as the terror, the purges, and repression colloquially refer to the same events, and he believes the most neutral terms are repression and mass killings. Mass killing. This term has been defined by Benjamin Valentino as the intentional killing of a massive number of non-combatants, where a massive number is defined as at least 50,000 intentional deaths over the course of 5 years or less. He applies this definition to the cases of Stalin's USSR, the PRC under Mao, and Cambodia under the Khmer Rouge, while admitting that mass killings on a smaller scale also appear to have been carried out by regimes in North Korea, Vietnam, Eastern Europe, and Africa. Communist Holocaust. The United States Congress has referred to the mass killings collectively as an unprecedented imperial communist holocaust, while the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation established by the United States Congress refers to this subject as the Communist Holocaust. The term Red Holocaust has been used by German historian Horst Mahler. Stephen Rosefielder has published a book on this subject titled Red Holocaust. Proposed causes. Ideology theories, such as those of R. J. Rummel, that propose communism as a significant causative factor in mass killings have attracted scholarly dispute. This article does not discuss academic acceptance of such theories. K. L. Asgoran Carlson writes that ideologies are systems of ideas which cannot commit crimes independently. However, individuals, collectives and states that have defined themselves as communist have committed crimes in the name of communist ideology, or without naming communism as the direct source of motivation for the crimes. According to Rudolf Joseph Rummel, the killings done by communist regimes can be explained with the marriage between absolute power and an absolutist ideology, Marxism. Of all religions, secular and otherwise, Rummel positions Marxism as by far the bloodiest, bloodier than the Catholic Inquisition, the various Catholic Crusades, and the 30 Years' War between Catholics and Protestants. In practice, Marxism has meant bloody terrorism, deadly purges, lethal prison camps and murderous forced labor, fatal deportations, man-made famines, extrajudicial executions and fraudulent show trials, outright mass murder and genocide. Quote, he writes that in practice the Marxists saw the construction of their utopia as a war on poverty, exploitation, imperialism and inequality, and, as in a real war, non-combatants would unfortunately get caught in the battle. There would be necessary enemy casualties: the clergy, bourgeoisie, capitalists, wreckers, intellectuals, counter-revolutionaries, rightists, tyrants, the rich and landlords. As in a war, millions might die, but these deaths would be justified by the end, as in the defeat of Hitler in World War II. To the ruling Marxists, the goal of a communist utopia was enough to justify all the deaths. In his book Red Holocaust, Stephen Rosefielder argues that communism's internal contradictions caused to be killed approximately 60 million people and perhaps tens of millions more, and that this Red Holocaust, the peacetime mass killings and other related crimes against humanity perpetrated by communist leaders such as Joseph Stalin, Kim Il-sung, Mao Zedong, Ho Chi Minh and Pol Pot, should be the centerpiece of any net assessment of communism. He states that the aforementioned leaders are collectively guilty of Holocaust-scale felonious homicides. Robert Conquest stressed that Stalin's purges were not contrary to the principles of Leninism. but rather a natural consequence of the system established by Vladimir Lenin, who personally ordered the killing of local groups of class enemy hostages. Alexander Yakovlev, architect of perestroika and glasnost and later head of the Presidential Commission for the Victims of Political Repression, elaborates on this point, stating that the truth is that in punitive operations Stalin did not think up anything that was not there under Lenin. Executions, hostage-taking, concentration camps, and all the rest. Historian Robert Gellertly concurs, saying, to put it another way, Stalin initiated very little that Lenin had not already introduced or previewed. Said Lenin to his colleagues in the Bolshevik government, if we are not ready to shoot a saboteur and white guardist, what sort of revolution is that? Anne Applebaum asserts that, without exception, the Leninist belief in the one-party state was and is characteristic of every communist regime, and the Bolshevik use of violence was repeated in every communist revolution. Phrases said by Lenin and Cheka founder Felix Dzerzhinsky were deployed all over the world. She notes that as late as 1976, Mengistu Haile Mariam unleashed a red terror in Ethiopia. In the lost literature of socialism, literary historian George G. Watson saw socialism as conservative, a reaction against liberalism and an attempt to return to antiquity and hierarchy. He states that the writings of Friedrich Engels and others show that the Marxist theory of history required and demanded genocide for reasons implicit in its claim that feudalism, which in advanced nations was already giving place to capitalism, must in its turn be superseded by socialism. Entire nations would be left behind after a workers' revolution, feudal remnants in a socialist age, and since they could not advance 2 steps at a time, they would have to be killed. They were racial trash, as Engels called them, and fit only for the dung heap of history. Watson's claims have been criticized by Robert Grant for dubious evidence, arguing that what Marx and Engels are calling for is, at the very least, a kind of cultural genocide, but it is not obvious, at least from Watson's citations, that actual mass killing, rather than mere absorption or assimilation, is in question. Daniel Goldhagen, Richard Pipes, and John N. Gray have written about theories regarding the role of communism in books for a popular audience. Crisis Conditions. Eric D. White says that the mass killing in communist states are a natural consequence of the failure of the rule of law, seen commonly during periods of social upheaval in the 20th century. For both communist and non-communist mass killings, genocides occurred at moments of extreme social crisis, often generated by the very policies of the regimes. Quote, "They are not inevitable but are political decisions." Stephen Hicks of Rockford College ascribes the violence characteristic of 20th-century socialist rule to these collectivist regimes: abandonment of protections of civil rights and rejection of the values of civil society. Hicks writes that whereas, in practice, every liberal capitalist country has a solid record for being humane, for by and large respecting rights and freedoms, and for making it possible for people to put together fruitful and meaningful lives, in socialism, practice has time and again proved itself more brutal than the worst dictatorships prior to the 20th century. Each socialist regime has collapsed into dictatorship and begun killing people on a huge scale. The Black Book of Communism, a set of academic essays on mass killings under communist regimes, details crimes, terror, and repression from Russia in 1917 to Afghanistan in 1989. Gurdwar claims an association between communism and criminality. Communist regimes turned mass crime into a full-blown system of government, and says that this criminality lies at the level of ideology rather than state. Practice. Benjamin Valentino writes that mass killing strategies are chosen by communists to economically dispossess large numbers of people. Social transformations of this speed and magnitude have been associated with mass killing for two primary reasons. First, the massive social dislocations produced by such changes have often led to economic collapse, epidemics, and, most important, widespread famines. The second reason that communist regimes bent on the radical transformation of society have been linked to mass killing is that the revolutionary changes they have pursued have clashed inexorably with the fundamental interests of large segments of the populations. Few people have proved willing to accept such far-reaching sacrifices without intense levels of coercion. Michael Mann writes, "The greatest communist death rates were not intended but resulted from gigantic policy mistakes worsened by factionalism, and also somewhat by callous or revengeful views of the victims." According to Axamelin, communist systems emerging in the 20th century ended up destroying their own populations, not because they planned to annihilate them as such, but because they aimed to restructure the social body from top to bottom, even if that meant purging it and recarving it to suit the new Promethean political imaginaire. Other claims influence of national cultures. Martin Meilia called Russian exceptionalism and the war experience general reasons for barbarity. Secular values. Some proponents of traditional ethical standards and religious faith argue that the killings were at least partly the result of a weakening of faith, and the unleashing of the radical values of the European Enlightenment upon the modern world. Observing this kind of trend in critical scholarship, the University of Oklahoma political scientist Alan D. Hutsky zooms in on the ideas of British Catholic writer and historian Paul Johnson and writes that personal responsibility. The Russian and world history scholar John M. Thompson describes the system of terror developed during Stalin's time as puzzling, surveying Russian history. He posits the height of the killings in the Soviet Union in the 1930s as a function of Soviet leader Joseph Stalin's personality, specifically, contending that historian Helen Rappaport describes Nikolai Yezhov, the bureaucrat in charge of the NKVD during the Great Purge, as a physically diminutive figure of limited intelligence and narrow political understanding. Like other instigators of mass murder throughout history, compensated for his lack of physical stature with a pathological cruelty and the use of brute terror. Comparison to other mass killings. Daniel Goldhagen argues that 20th-century communist regimes have killed more people than any other regime type. Quote, "Other scholars in the fields of communist studies and genocide studies, such as Stephen Rosefielder, Benjamin Valentino, and R. J. Rummel, have come to similar conclusions." Rosefielder states that it is possible the Red Holocaust killed more non-combatants than Harsho and Japan's Asian Holocaust combined, and was at least as heinous, given the singularity of Hitler's genocide. Rosefielder also notes that, while it is fashionable to mitigate the Red Holocaust by observing that capitalism killed millions of colonials in the 20th century, primarily through man-made famines, no inventory of such felonious negligent homicides comes close to the Red Holocaust total.